On a grey autumn morning in Northern Ireland in 1983, the Maze prison stood as a symbol of British authority during one of the darkest periods of the Troubles. Known locally by its former name Long Kesh, this maximum security facility housed some of the most committed Republican prisoners, men who had been convicted of offences ranging from possession of weapons to murder in the name of Irish unity. The prison itself was a sprawling complex of H-shaped blocks designed specifically to replace the old Nissen huts that had previously held paramilitary prisoners. Each H-block was supposed to be escape-proof, with multiple layers of security, watchtowers and protocols that had been refined over years of holding some of the most determined prisoners in Western Europe. But on September 25, 1983, 38 men would prove that no prison is truly escape-proof when determination, planning, and opportunity align. This wasn't a spontaneous riot or a desperate scramble over walls. This was something far more sophisticated, a carefully orchestrated operation that had been planned for months, involving smuggled materials, coded messages, and a level of coordination that would have impressed military strategists. The escape would become the largest breakout in British penal history and would send shockwaves through the British establishment, raising uncomfortable questions about security, intelligence failures, and the very nature of the conflict in Northern Ireland. The story really begins long before that September day. To understand how such a massive escape could happen, you need to understand the context of the Maze prison itself and what it meant to be a Republican prisoner there in the early 1980s. The Maze had been built to replace the internment camps and old prison facilities that had become flashpoints during the Troubles. When it opened, it was meant to be a modern, secure facility that would end the constant security problems that had plagued earlier detention centers. The H-blocks were designed with security in mind at every level. Each block had 4 wings extending from a central area, and the layout was supposed to make it nearly impossible for prisoners to coordinate any large-scale action. The prisoners held there were members of the Provisional IRA and other Republican paramilitary groups. These weren't ordinary criminals in any conventional sense. They saw themselves as political prisoners, soldiers in a war against British occupation of Northern Ireland. This self-perception was crucial to everything that happened at the Maze, including the escape. These men maintained military discipline even inside the prison walls. They had a command structure. They followed orders from their leaders both inside and outside the prison. And they never stopped thinking of themselves as active combatants, just temporarily detained. The British government, particularly under Margaret Thatcher, had taken a hard line on this issue. In 1976, the special category status that had effectively recognized paramilitary prisoners as different from ordinary criminals was withdrawn. This led directly to the blanket protest, where Republican prisoners refused to wear prison uniforms, wrapping themselves in blankets instead, and then to the dirty protest, where they smeared their cells with excrement rather than comply with prison rules. The situation had escalated to the 1981 hunger strikes, where Bobby Sands and 9 other men starved themselves to death demanding the return of political status. By 1983, the hunger strikes were over, but the bitterness and determination they had generated had not faded. If anything, the prisoners were more committed than ever. It was in this atmosphere that the escape plan began to shake tape.
The exact genesis of the plan is difficult to pinpoint, as the prisoners involved maintained strict secrecy, and the planning happened through whispered conversations during exercise periods, coded letters that passed through the prison mail system, and messages smuggled in and out through various means. What is known is that by the summer of 1983, a core group of prisoners had begun serious planning for a mass breakout. This wasn't the first escape attempt from the maze. There had been previous efforts, some successful on a small scale, but this was going to be different in ambition and scope.
The plan required several key elements to come together. First, they needed weapons, or at least convincing replicas of weapons. In a maximum security prison, getting real firearms inside would be extraordinarily difficult, though not necessarily impossible. The prisoners managed to acquire or create several handguns. Some accounts suggest these were real weapons that had been smuggled in, possibly hidden in delivery vehicles or passed through corrupt guards, though this has never been definitively proven. Other accounts suggest at least some were very convincing replicas or modified starter pistols. For the purpose of the escape, it didn't matter much whether the guns could actually fire. What mattered was that the guards believed they could. Second, they needed detailed knowledge of the prison's routines, particularly the schedule of food deliveries and the procedures guards followed. The prisoners had years of observation to draw on. They knew when deliveries came. They knew which guards were on duty at different times. They knew the layout of every corridor and gate. They studied the patterns obsessively, noting the smallest variations, looking for any weakness they could exploit. Third, they needed coordination among a large group of men who would be involved in the escape. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect. Nearly 40 men would need to move together, overpower guards, seize control of the H-block, and get through multiple security checkpoints before anyone could raise an effective alarm. Any hesitation, any mistake, any one person failing to do their part could doom the entire operation. The prisoners involved were housed primarily in H-Block 7. This block held some of the most senior IRA prisoners, men who had experience with military operations on the outside and who could bring that tactical knowledge to bear on planning the escape. The leadership inside the block maintained discipline and kept the plan secret even from prisoners who weren't going to be directly involved. This operational security was crucial. The prison authorities had informers, and a whisper of a major escape plan could have led to lockdowns, transfers, or increased searches that would have made the attempt impossible. As September approached, the final pieces began falling into place. The date was chosen carefully. It needed to be a day when the timing of deliveries aligned with shift changes and other factors that would give them the best chance. September 25th was a Sunday, and the timing of the afternoon food delivery created what the planners saw as an optimal window. On that Sunday afternoon, the prison was operating on its normal routine. The food lorry arrived at H Block 7 to deliver the afternoon meal, just as it did every day. This was a Guinness lorry that had been contracted to deliver food to the prison. The driver and his assistant had no idea what was about to happen. They drove up to the block, expecting just another routine delivery, the same process they had gone through countless times before. Inside the block, the prisoners were ready. The tension must have been extraordinary. These men knew that if the escape failed, they would likely face additional charges, longer sentences, and much harsher conditions. Some of them were already serving life sentences. But they also knew that a failed escape attempt could mean beatings, isolation, and the crushing of any hope. But they also knew that if they succeeded, they would strike a blow against the system that held them. They would return to the struggle outside, and they would demonstrate that even the most secure prison couldn't hold them. When the delivery men entered the block, the prisoners moved with practiced precision. They had rehearsed this in their minds countless times. A group of prisoners rushed the delivery men and the guards supervising the delivery. The smuggled weapons came out. Whether they were real or replicas, they looked convincing enough, and the guards and delivery men found themselves staring down the barrels of what they believed were loaded pistols. The prisoners made it clear that resistance would be met with violence. They needed the delivery men's uniforms, and they needed the guards' uniforms and keys.
The takeover of H Block 7 happened remarkably quickly. The prisoners had the advantage of surprise, numbers, and absolute commitment. The guards on duty in the block were overwhelmed before they could effectively respond. Some tried to resist and were physically overpowered. The prisoners weren't gratuitously violent. They had a mission to accomplish, and unnecessary violence would only complicate things. But they used whatever force was necessary to gain control. Guards were tied up, locked in cells, and threatened with their weapons. The prisoners took their uniforms, their keys, and their radios. This is where one of the tragic elements of the escape occurred. During the takeover, a prison officer named James Ferris was confronted by the escaping prisoners. The exact details of what happened are disputed, but Ferris, who was in his 50s, suffered a heart attack during the incident. He collapsed, and despite the chaos, some accounts suggest prisoners actually tried to get medical help for him. But in the confusion, and with the prisoners focused on the escape, effective help didn't arrive in time. Ferris died, making him the only fatality of the escape itself, though his death would add significantly to the charges that would later be brought against some of the escapees. With H Block 7 secured, the prisoners moved to the next phase. They had guards' uniforms, and they had control of the block. But they still needed to get through the prison gates and out of the compound. This is where the food lorry became crucial. The plan was to load as many prisoners as possible into the back of the lorry, hidden among the food containers and equipment, while others dressed in the guards' uniforms would ride in the cab or walk alongside, pretending to be escorting the vehicle out. The prisoners organized themselves quickly. Those who most looked like they could pass for guards in uniform took those roles. The others climbed into the back of the lorry. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, but that didn't matter. What mattered was getting out. The driver of the lorry was forced to cooperate, with a prisoner holding a gun to him and giving directions. The vehicle began moving toward the gate.
The maze had multiple security checkpoints, layers of gates and barriers designed to prevent exactly this kind of escape. The prisoners knew they would have to pass through at least 2, possibly 3 gates to get out of the complex entirely. Each gate represented a potential point of failure. If a guard at any checkpoint became suspicious, if someone raised an alarm, if the deception was noticed, the entire escape would collapse and they would be trapped, probably facing armed response units. The lorry approached the first gate. The prisoners, dressed as guards, tried to look casual, authoritative, like this was just another routine movement inside the prison. The tension must have been unbearable. Every second felt like an hour. The guards at the gate looked at the lorry, looked at the men in uniforms, and, following standard procedure, prepared to let the vehicle through. The first gate opened. They moved forward to the next checkpoint. At this point, some of the real guards who had been taken hostage were still with the group, being used as human shields and to provide legitimacy if anyone asked questions. The prisoners were gambling that the guards at the gates wouldn't want to risk their colleagues' lives by raising an alarm or refusing to open the gates. It was a calculated use of the guards as leverage. At the second checkpoint, there was more scrutiny. One of the guards on duty seemed uncertain about something. Accounts vary about exactly what aroused suspicion, whether it was something about the timing of the delivery, something odd about the behavior of the men in uniforms, or just an instinct that something wasn't right. There was a tense exchange. The prisoners had to think fast. They couldn't afford a confrontation here, not with armed guards in watchtowers who could open fire on the lorry. They needed to maintain the deception just a little longer. One of the prisoners, thinking quickly, began talking about a supposed emergency or special situation that required the vehicle to leave immediately. The details of this conversation have been reconstructed from various accounts, and the exact words may never be known with certainty, but the prisoner was convincing enough. Perhaps the guard at the gate was still suspicious, but didn't want to make waves without being sure. Perhaps the presence of what appeared to be other guards vouched for the situation. Perhaps it was just luck. Whatever the reason, after what must have felt like an eternity to the men hiding in the back of the lorry, the second gate opened. But they still weren't free. The lorry was now in an area between the inner and outer security perimeters. This was still prison property, still under surveillance, still patrolled. They needed to get through the final gate to reach the roads outside. The outer gate was the last barrier between them and freedom, but it was also the point where security was often most stringent because it was the final line of defense. As they approached this gate, something went wrong. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, but the most commonly reported version is that one of the guards at the outer gate definitely became suspicious. He refused to open the gate immediately and wanted to verify the authorization for the vehicle to leave. This was the nightmare scenario the prisoners had feared. If an alarm went out now, while they were still inside the outer perimeter, they would be trapped with nowhere to go. The prisoners in the lorry had to make a split-second decision. Some of them jumped out of the vehicle. The deception was over. They rushed the gate, overwhelming the guards there through sheer numbers and the threat of the weapons they carried. It became a scramble, violent and chaotic. The guards fought back, but were overpowered. The prisoners forced the gate open, and the lorry, along with men now running on foot, burst through the outer security perimeter. Now alarms were definitely going off. The prison authorities realized what was happening. A mass escape was in progress. But the crucial minutes of confusion and surprise had done their job. By the time armed response could be organized, the prisoners were scattering into the countryside around the prison. Some of the men stayed with the lorry for a short distance, but they knew they needed to abandon it quickly. A large food lorry was too conspicuous and too slow. They had planned for this. The escapees split into smaller groups, some heading on foot to cross fields, others looking for vehicles they could steal. The area around the Maze prison was not exactly sympathetic territory for escaping IRA prisoners. This was not a Republican stronghold where they could expect automatic help from locals, so they needed to move fast and stay hidden. The British Army and Royal Ulster Constabulary quickly mobilized. Helicopters took to the air, roadblocks were set up, and a massive manhunt began. But the prisoners had several advantages. First, they had the initial head start from the confusion at the prison. Second, they were highly motivated and had been planning their next moves. Third, many of them were experienced in evading security forces from their time in the IRA before their imprisonment. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the sheer number of escapees meant that security forces had to spread their resources thin, trying to track down 38 different men who were splitting up and going in different directions. The escape sent immediate shockwaves through Northern Ireland and across Britain. This was headline news, a massive embarrassment for the government and prison service. Margaret Thatcher's government had staked its reputation on taking a hard line against terrorism and maintaining security. Now, the most secure prison in Northern Ireland had just seen the largest escape in British history. The political fallout was immediate. Questions were asked in Parliament. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland faced intense pressure. The prison service launched an immediate inquiry into how this could have happened. In the hours and days following the escape, the manhunt intensified. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras scanned the countryside. Every car was suspect, every movement noted. Roadblocks were everywhere. The security forces were determined to recapture the escapees as quickly as possible, both to prevent them from returning to paramilitary activity and to mitigate the propaganda disaster that the escape represented.
The first recaptures came relatively quickly. Some of the escapees were found within hours, hiding in fields or trying to make their way to safe houses. These men had not managed to get far enough away or find adequate hiding places before the net closed around them. Within the first day, several were back in custody, but many others remained free. The escapees who evaded immediate capture faced difficult decisions. Some tried to make their way south to the Irish Republic, where they would be outside the immediate jurisdiction of British security forces, though they would still face the risk of extradition. Others headed for areas of Belfast or Derry, where they had connections and could potentially disappear into Republican communities. Still others tried to leave Ireland entirely, heading for Britain or even continental Europe. The IRA's external organization swung into action to help the escapees who remained free. Safe houses were arranged, false documents were prepared, and plans were made to move men out of the immediate danger area. This wasn't charity. These were experienced volunteers who could potentially return to active service, and the organization wanted to protect that resource. But helping the escapees also involved risks. Security forces were watching known Republican safe houses, monitoring communications, and following any leads that might guide them to the fugitives. Over the following weeks and months, more escapees were recaptured. Some were found during raids on suspected safe houses. Others were caught at ferry ports or airports trying to leave Ireland. A few were arrested after being recognized in public. The circumstances of each recapture became a minor news story, a small victory for the security forces against the background of the larger embarrassment. But as time went on, it became clear that not all of the 38 were going to be quickly rounded up.
19 of the 38 escapees were eventually recaptured, most within the first few months, though some took longer. but 19 remained free for much longer periods, with several evading recapture for years. A few were never recaptured at all, at least not for decades. Some of these men managed to build new lives, either in the Irish Republic or abroad, living under assumed names and always looking over their shoulders. Others returned to active service in the IRA and continued the armed struggle until they were either killed or captured in subsequent operations. The political and security ramifications of the escape continued to unfold long after the day itself. The inquiry into how the escape happened revealed serious lapses in security procedures. The complacency that had set in, the routines that had become too predictable, the failure to properly search vehicles, the inadequate supervision of prisoners during deliveries, all of these factors contributed to creating the opportunity the prisoners had exploited. Heads rolled in the prison service. New procedures were implemented. Security was dramatically tightened, not just at the maze, but at prisons throughout the United Kingdom. But the damage to British prestige had been done. The escape was celebrated in Republican circles as a tremendous victory. Songs were written about it, murals were painted, and the story became part of Republican law. The fact that these men had been held in what was supposed to be one of the most secure prisons in Europe and had still managed to escape in such numbers was proof in the Republican narrative that the British could not win, that Irish determination could overcome any obstacle, that the cause was unstoppable. For the families of the prisoners involved, the escape brought mixed emotions. Some families were overjoyed to have their loved ones free, even if that freedom was precarious and temporary. Others worried constantly about what would happen when their family member was recaptured, as most assumed they would be. The families of prisoners who remained on the run lived in a strange limbo, never quite knowing where their loved ones were, unable to have normal contact, always aware that a knock on the door might bring news of arrest or worse.
The escape also had implications for the wider conflict in Northern Ireland. It demonstrated that even under maximum security conditions, the IRA could carry out sophisticated operations. It showed a level of organization and planning that worried security officials. If they could orchestrate an escape of this magnitude from inside prison, what were they capable of on the outside? The escape led to a reassessment of the threat posed by Republican paramilitary groups and contributed to changes in counterterrorism strategy. For the guards and prison staff who had been held hostage during the escape, the psychological trauma was significant. Some of these men were tied up and threatened with weapons for hours, not knowing if they would be killed. The death of James Ferris haunted his colleagues. Many prison officers left the service after the escape, unable to continue working in an environment where they had felt so vulnerable. The prison service had to provide psychological support and counseling, though in the early 1980s, such support was far less developed than it would later become. The legal proceedings that followed the escape were complex and lengthy. Some of the recaptured prisoners faced additional charges related to the escape itself, including charges related to the death of James Ferris. In some cases, these new charges added years to already lengthy sentences. Defense lawyers argued that their clients had been exercising a duty to try to escape as prisoners of war, though British courts rejected this argument, maintaining that these were criminals, not soldiers. The trials became another arena where the fundamental dispute about the nature of the conflict was played out. Years later, as the peace process began to take shape in Northern Ireland, some of those involved in the escape would play roles in the political developments.
The 1998 Good Friday Agreement included provisions for the early release of paramilitary prisoners, and many of those who had been recaptured after the escape were released under these provisions. Some of the escapees who had evaded recapture eventually returned to Ireland openly after the peace agreement, no longer facing the threat of immediate arrest. The escape, which had seemed so significant at the time, became a historical event, something to be studied and debated rather than an active security concern.
The Maze prison itself would eventually close in the year 2000, its H-blocks empty, its purpose made obsolete by the peace process. There have been long debates about what to do with the site. Some wanted it preserved as a museum, a reminder of the Troubles and what Northern Ireland went through. Others wanted it demolished entirely, erasing a painful reminder of division and conflict. The site remains contentious, just as the escape itself remains a story that means different things depending on who tells it. For historians studying the Troubles, the Maze escape of 1983 represents a significant moment. It illustrates the commitment and capability of Republican prisoners, the failures of British security policy, and the ways in which spectacular events could shift the psychological dynamics of the conflict. It remains the largest prison escape in British history, a record unlikely to ever be broken given the changes in prison security that followed. The men who participated in the escape, whether they were recaptured quickly or remained free, became legends in Republican circles. Their story was told and retold, becoming more dramatic with each telling, that the basic facts remained extraordinary enough without embellishment. They had done what was supposed to be impossible. They had broken out of the maze.